Good afternoon. Of course, it's afternoon here. I have no idea what time it might be where you are. And time is a relative thing, a mysterious thing. Though most of us know something of what is meant when we use this word or we hear this word. It's a very, very mysterious process, array of processes, nested array of processes. Certainly when I enter the garden, my experience of time is radically altered from the experience that I will have out in the city, in all the traffic and noise and movement, primarily of humans and their pets and their machines and their businesses. What I will experience here, though I can detect the nearby activity of many machines, because I can hear it. What I will experience in here is an entirely different kind of time. Fundamentally, our experience of time is relational and relative to something, to our context, yeah? To what's going on in our context. So, out in the city, there are what I might call hundreds or maybe thousands of events per minute, and there are tens or hundreds of events per second. It's a lot of busyness. And most of it is meaningless in that I don't relate to it. It doesn't relate with me. I am aware of it, and I have to modulate my behavior to survive in it. If I step unawares into the street, there's a good chance that I'll be obliterated by a machine. The tempos and rhythms are set primarily by machines and clocks and businesses. Whereas in here, they're fundamentally quieter. And while we might say, in the sense of physics or biophysics, there are trillions of events per second, which of course is true, at the micro scale. At the macro scale, what would qualify as an event, something that I can detect and relate with, is vastly slower. Most of the things around me here, if they are moving at all, they are gently swaying in the afternoon breeze. And it's beautiful. And it's quiet. except for the sounds of water. Since it has rained recently, I can hear some water dripping off of leaves and such, and I can hear some bird music. And occasionally I may encounter a human being here. And there are my footfalls, which have a rhythm. And there is the sound of the jet. So that even in the garden, it's quite difficult to escape the constant intrusion of the noise of machines. This tree is really amazingly beautiful. And it's growing. It's growing right now. But I would have to be capable of transforming the rate at which my visual awareness functions to be able to detect its growing visually. I'm really fascinated by time. For our verbal and conceptual minds, time seems linear. For a nonverbal mind, time is perhaps more like a sphere, with now at the center. Or perhaps now at the periphery, and everything at the center, depending on how we choose to think of it. In my long fascination with temporality, I've learned things so staggering, so astonishing, that they make the science fiction that I read as a youth seem very conservative. And I read a lot of science fiction as a young man. Primarily, I read science fiction from the 20s through the 70s, and some science fiction written in the 80s, but I would guess the majority of what I read was written in the 50s and 60s and 70s. By people like Asimov and Bradbury and Harlan Ellison, who once yelled at me for 15 minutes. A.E. Van Vogt, David Brin, Philip K. Dick, Samuel Delaney, Ursula Le Guin, Anne McCaffrey, a number of people men and women who use pseudonyms, and women often did. Some of my favorite women did. And those authors seem to me to be another species of human capable of a form of vision that the people around me did not have. And indeed they were capable of this kind of vision. An often dangerous vision. And in fact, I believe Harlan Ellison edited a couple of books called Dangerous Visions, in which he asked science fiction authors to give him their most controversial stories. And those books are quite profound, very useful. Now, I have come to a part of the garden First of all, I can hear distant thunder. Pretty sure. Secondly, the music of the birds is fundamentally influencing, it's catalyzing the temporality. And there's quite a bit of it. And from this position, from where I'm standing, it's layered. And the music differs in different directions. Oh, there is a kestrel. Oh, beautiful dive. Beautiful wing-folding dive by the kestrel. One of my very favorite raptors. Small raptor, who I once, during a difficult conversation with my father, observed atop a telephone pole, eating something. It took me a while, and it was like shaking. It would eat something and shake its head. And it took me a while to figure out what it was doing. I believe that it had acquired either an entire wasp nest or part of one, and was consuming larvae from this nest while being stung in the face, in and around the face, by wasps. And that to me was very symbolic of the task of the quest for awareness and understanding and companionship and security and beauty that our human incarnation, our human lives can become, if we so choose. And I suspect that my long acquaintance with science fiction and fantasy planted seeds in me that led me to an awareness that I could live a heroic and astonishing adventure, if not quite equal to those in the stories I'd read, at least influenced by them and having some of their character. As it turned out, I should have realized stories aren't bigger than life. Life is bigger than stories. And even if we are isolated or in poverty or otherwise seemingly compromised, our life is can be understood to be like a space-time ship in which profound adventures may unfold if we seek them. And if we are bold enough and curious enough and passionate enough, and that passion is crucially important. If we are heartful enough, attentive enough, inquisitive and in love enough, then we shall have adventures that surpass those of which we've read, however heroic they may seem on the page or in our minds, in our imaginations. And I've been always interested in this idea of questing. I associate the idea with stories I've read about knights, meaning the peculiar men who took on quests, dangerous and bizarre sometimes. Excuse me. Because this is one of the common places in stories where we hear about this phenomenon. Though in science fiction and fantasy, particularly in fantasy, questing is very deeply and profoundly, diversely represented. And I wonder if our lives, with all their mystery and profundity, are, whether we are aware of it or not, an experience of having an incredible adventure for an array of purposes, beautiful, noble, profound, deep, invisible, mysterious, sometimes visible. But for most of us, largely hidden most of the time. I'm fascinated by the results of the quests I've embarked upon in my life. I have one in my heart at the moment. It's like a secret mission, or something that has to be done partly in a dream. And dreaming seems deeply related to questing. So too the visionary mind. And if we set our goals, if we set our standards very high in the quests we take on, perhaps even if we don't, we will tread a path that hopefully, if it lies between madness and prodigy, primarily comes down either in the middle or on the side of genius. Now, all of us are familiar with setting a goal and pursuing it. When we use this language, it sounds very pragmatic. I need to go to the store. I will gather together my list, my method of payment, so on and so forth. I will get the things from the store. I will complete the task. But there are quests, I think, invisible to us, associated with our life, that unless we are either very lucky or very curious, we may never become aware of. I suspect, for example, that there is something resembling the idea of a soul that is associated with our human incarnation. For most of us, this is a matter of belief, either of belief, opinion, or mere nomenclature, words. And yet I have good reason in my own experience and understanding and life path to trust that something resembling a soul, and perhaps far more profound than one, exists, is part of us, is an aspect of our being. And I also suspect that various kinds of dreaming, and there are many kinds, are deeply associated with this organ of our being, and that it influences deeply many things about our humanity, possibly including our appearance, our orientation, our character, our persona, our fears, our loves, our passions, our curiosity. There is probably no aspect of our humanity that I think is uninfluenced by whatever I may refer to as a soul. And in some wisdom traditions, there are many aspects. What we have learned about Egyptian spiritual or metaphysical models or frameworks is very sophisticated. Seems very sophisticated. Just putting some white sage oil, which I love, on my face. The smell of it is so beautiful. And by the way, scents and essences were long associated with soul or spirit. Spirit being that which can travel invisibly through the atmosphere between beings, right? So I'm not an expert on the Egyptian model, but there are models that have, for example, the soul, the body, the name, the shadow, the traveling soul, the personality, so we can imagine that a soul might either be very complex and not unlike our body have organs, although most of us, I think, are familiar with and habituated, if we think of souls at all, to think of it as a single thing. I suspect it's more complex, but the body, our body itself doesn't really have parts unless you start to cut it open. We can refer to different elements of the body by name and see them as separate, talk of them as separate. Or we can see it fundamentally as a unity, or we can even see like the world as a unity and our body as an organ in that unity, or the universe, or all of time, space, or whatever. So, whether things have parts or not isn't necessarily intrinsic to those things, but rather to our purposes in thinking about, or speaking about, or modeling, or imagining them. But I do suspect there are different aspects of whatever we might refer to as a soul. And I think our human birth can be meaningfully understood as a radical adventure, a radical physical embodied adventure for something that is ordinarily not physical. And we might have different words for that not physicalness. We might call it energetic. Diaphanous. Transparent. That's an interesting one. Transparent. Perhaps differing from apparent. Transcendental, metaphysical. I don't know the best language to speak of these things in. And so I will stumble now and then as I try to orbit the topic. But what I hope to reflect on today is that our human birth is a precious opportunity for kinds of development that we have little language for. And these aspects of development are known to traditions we would categorize as spiritual, or at least within those traditions there is language about them. There are models of this kind of development. However confused those models may be, or incomplete. But the fundamental situation is both mysterious, in that it is fundamentally mysterious. It's so mysterious, no model or framework will ever properly capture it. And we should I believe we should bear that in mind. There are many aspects of things we can speak toward that we actually know nearly nothing about, other than we have some name that points at some referent in a conceptual or lexical system. But we do not know the essence of the things we have named. We don't know their purpose from the perspective, from any perspective that is more true, without being perfectly true, than those perspectives we've been exposed to, because we are like consumers of ideas, most of us. We rarely form them ourselves. They are not formed by trustworthy groups. They come down to us, handed down to us in linguistic and conceptual and pragmatic overlays from history and supercultures and nations, societies. And most of these are intrinsically untrustworthy as regards the nature of identity or meaning, possibility, opportunity. They're untrustworthy because their purposes were skewed. And some pragmatists, people pragmatically minded, would say, well, except for science. And I understand why they might think that, but they'd still be confused, because although science and its introduction into human ideation is very profound and meaningful and powerful, it's also easily confused. There are many aspects of our being that science is ill-equipped to do anything with at all. Many aspects of the nature of nature that science will never come close to. And some people hope that science and religion will produce some sort of amalgam, right? That science and religion will at last get married and maybe have a kid. But it's a weird idea, because these two things need to remain distinct for all kinds of important reasons, generally speaking. This doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that I only oppose such attempts, but most of them, I think, are ill-informed and misapprehend or misframe the nature of these two domains of human curiosity and thought, tradition, history, activity. I've been a big fan of science my whole life, and I still am. Without science, there's all kinds of things we would never have learned. But some of those learnings have come at terrible cost. And I think it's a bad idea to torture or injure or trap living things, living beings, to gain information about the mechanics of their biology. I think that's a very, very dangerous idea. The world is made of relationships. Those relationships matter and cannot be disregarded for the sake of learning things. And yet, science so far has been very consistently willing to, actually the correct way of saying this is that certain researchers have been willing to pursue knowledge nearly at any cost, possibly including the cost of exterminating life on Earth, by giving supercultures technologies, right? These come from research. And when the results of research are placed in the hands of supercultures, our science can become very, very deadly. And the experiment is ongoing. We don't yet know whether the human relationship with science has already pulled the trigger on the extinction of life on Earth or not. We don't yet know. It may well be true that the trigger was pulled 15 years ago or 50 years ago. And we're just waiting for the bullet to hit, to hit home. And some people will say, well, science is our only hope of rescue from this. And they could also be right. The question's mysterious. But what I'm trying to highlight is just that the apparent heroism of scientific research is often very confusingly founded. And it's difficult to separate the researcher from the research, from the context, from the effects, from its transmission to corporations and supercultures, and what they will do with it, including drug companies and the military-industrial complex, prisons, and corporations like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, so on. So while I've always been fascinated by science, in my adult life I became quite reticent about the results of scientific endeavor in modern human culture. And science, of course, isn't a thing. It's a behavior. It's a way of asking questions and determining reliable, partial answers. It's a method. There is no thing science as a being. Science doesn't tell us things, humans do. There's a lot of linguistic confusion surrounding this idea, and the same is true of religion. And both science and religion have had catastrophically lethal effects when their produce is distributed into human societies. And perhaps part of my quest is to understand how this happened. How did all this happen? But the thing that I'm actually interested in today is to just begin to reflect on this idea that our soul is having an adventure called Incarnation. And we all have, nearly all of us, we all have adventures at night. This is weird. This is really a strange... So, I'm having a little bit of an adventure right now. This ground here is strangely liquescent. Almost like quicksand. It's like there's jelly underneath it, but it's just in this one little spot. The ground around it isn't like that. Well, at least, well, no, I guess some of the ground nearby is. It's probably just mud. But we all, or nearly all of us, we have adventures that I think in which our soul is to some degree involved, at sometimes very deeply, at sometimes rather shallowly, that we call dreams. Now, I'm not the first person to suggest that our incarnation is a special mode of dreaming, though it is not merely dreaming. You see, the world of dreams can transform almost without what seem to be rules. And there's a certain kind of continuity to waking experience for most of us, most of the time, that is unlike that of dreaming. We wake up in the same room, usually, that we go to sleep in, for example. And there's continuity of all kinds of features of our relationships: financial, social, romantic, interpersonal, vocational. Whereas when we go to sleep and dream, even when we're dreaming in a thread and we're having like dreams that are very similar night after night, or have a certain theme repeated night after night, which has been relatively uncommon in my life, but not entirely uncommon. The dreaming world is not consistent in the same kinds of ways that the waking world is. This doesn't mean it has no consistency. It does. It has various aspects of consistency. But I'm led to suspect, and my experience supports this suspicion, that our human incarnation is an adventure that our soul is having. And I would like to suggest that it's a developmental adventure. That our soul is growing or developing or learning or acquiring sophistication from the adventures and situations and relationships and behaviors that we enact as human beings, embodied human beings. In a way not dissimilar to how we go from fertilized egg to blastocyst, to embryo, to baby, to infant, to baby, to child, to teenage, so on and so forth, right? Our human physical life is a series of physical developmental adventures, but also of cognitive and emotional and psychological adventures. So there is a kind of not merely physical aspect to our physical incarnation, unless we think of the psychological and the emotional and the intellectual as representations of underlying only representations of underlying physical phenomena, such as brain activity and in structuring and so on. And some people do think this way. Some people believe, for example, that consciousness is just a byproduct of the physical activity of the brain, and it ends there. I doubt it, though I understand something about this view. So some people think, these are primarily researchers and people who read them, or philosophers, that our experience is just and only the result of physical processes. And those of us who think... Now, I don't only think one way, by the way, and I'm not suggesting that any of you do. I'm capable of thinking of multiple models at the same time, and that's probably better than having just one. It's important that we entertain a variety of ideas, rather than what most of us have been trained to do, many of us have been trained to do, which is to select one and then just believe that one and sort of reject or fight against all the others. That is, I think, a very dangerous and unfortunate result of our miseducation. We should have a number of viable ideas and models and beliefs, because if we make a circle around a topic, right, and we can perceive it from multiple angles, and then even multiple layers of circles and multiple angles, some below, some above, some to the side, however we want to think about it, then we'll have an intelligent relationship in our cognition and thought and imagination about the nature of whatever the phenomenon in the center of that circle turns out to be, whatever we put in the center of that circle. And I would ask that we learn and help each other to learn to do this again, because what most of us have is a flat, single model belief system about very important things like, is there a soul, or what does it mean to be human, or what is an organism, what is the sun, what is the living world, is there a metaphysical, aspect to things or not. I think we need to have multiple models to have anything resembling intelligence about questions like this. And we can include those from science, but they should not necessarily dominate, for they are wildly incomplete, as all models will tend to be. Though incompleteness is not the only thing going on either. I would like us to preserve a big chunk of mystery when we're thinking about, and respect that it's mysterious, when we're thinking about big questions. What is time? What is light? Are there souls? Why do we incarnate as humans or hummingbird? Why do things incarnate as hummingbirds and trees and stuff? It seems pretty likely that they do. There are beings all around me. They appear to be related to me and relating with me in various ways. And in fact, my survival depends on them. If the homeostasis provided by the environment fails, if the temperature rises above about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, where photosynthesis stops happening, we all die. So it's pretty obvious there's from one perspective, there's one thing going on here. From another useful perspective, there's a bunch of distinct things going on here together. From another useful perspective, it's just me going on here. But I suspect our souls come to incarnation on a developmental adventure, and I think dreaming is involved in that adventure. And visioneering our future is involved in that adventure. And whether we think pragmatically or fantastically, imaginatively, it's very clear that prior to engaging in some task, you're probably going to imagine it, right? You're not just going to have a thought emerge with no imagination, which I think would be impossible because thinking is a form of imagining, that it's time to go to the store, right? Or it's time to go to work, or I have to complete some task, or this task is important and that one isn't, or this one's compelling and that one's boring. All of these involve imagination. And so this aspect of our consciousness and awareness is often dismissed as not realistic. If you didn't have your imagination, it would be impossible to form the perspective that your imagination is not realistic. You couldn't form any perspective at all. You could have a visual perspective, but not a psycho-emotional one. So I think we come to Earth on an adventure, and some of us learn to really live into that, to live into a grand, epic, beautiful, impassioned, sometimes ugly and terrible too, right? Not all of the adventures are good, and some of the adventures that people make of their lives are horrifying. It's not all flowers and butterflies and happy-go-lucky things, is it? Though those of us who have preserved some degree of free will and are not just addicted and are not just driven or compelled or trapped, but even those of us who are driven and compelled, addicted or trapped, we have an influence on how the adventure will unfold, and we can choose to set a quest line, to set a goal. So I have a goal. I mean, I have a number of them, many of them. One of my most ambitious is to change the human relationship with knowledge in a fundamental way. That's really big. Seems unlikely that I'll accomplish that one in this lifetime, but nonetheless I chip away at it. But a more personal, or not more personal, a more So I've had all kinds of unusual goals throughout my life. One of quests, one of which was to bring something really important back from a dream. And I think I've accomplished that on a couple of occasions. Although what I really wanted was to bring something, I wanted to bring something physical back from a dream. I don't know if I'll ever accomplish that, but there are targets near that that are more accessible. Yeah. I have lots of aspects of questing mind associated with my life. And even when things are very dark and very difficult, and I feel that I cannot go on, or that surely I will perish, or that very bad things will happen to me or are happening to me, and I'm frightened and I'm isolated, even when I have experiences like this, which are part of many people's lives, I retain the awareness and the desire to break free and to continue the quest no matter how dark. Hawk just flew by, and I know that hawk, and I know that hawk from this time of day, in this place. That hawk is often here. And if you see an animal doing something peculiar in nature, particularly if it's feeding or caching or relating with other animals, in a specific place at a specific time, there's a relatively good chance that if you go to somewhere near that place at near that time, you will see the animal again. Humans are also like this. So if you see a particularly interesting human, you may find them just as someone might find me right here in this garden in the afternoon. Right? Not too tough to find me here. That could lead to misadventure. There are humans that are not friendly to me. Thankfully, not too many of them, and very few to whom I am unfriendly. But they exist, and they too influence my quests. So I think we come to human incarnation and we have a rare and precious opportunity to adventure in a way that develops and educates. Maybe educate is the wrong word. I wish I had a better one. But our soul, and maybe various elements of our soul, our persona, our mind, our intellect, our shadow, our hearts, they are developing, right? And the adventures that we have in life help them to develop. And when those adventures are beautiful and communal and passionate and, in a way, lucky or blessed, we develop really amazingly, and we can forge an entirely new mind. We can forge a new heart. We can acquire abilities that were previously impossible to us. And we seem to, as a people, we seem to celebrate those whose adventure leads them to some developmental excellence that is often turned into a commodity and then sort of sold back to society with great fanfare. But it is not those kinds of adventures that I'm particularly concerned with, though I acknowledge their power and the compelling nature of the spectacle they produce. No, it's something more humble in terms of its public face, but more profound in terms of its private face. Yeah? It's these kinds of adventures that I'm very interested in. I'm interested in adventures that might be invisible to the public, but inwardly so beautiful and profound and deep and rich, maybe sacred or holy, that they lift, they advance the bar of what it can mean to be human and lead a human life. And sometimes these are adventures that involve rescue. And of course, I'm a big fan of heroism. I think rescue, mutual uplift and rescue is profoundly important and compelling. During one of my adventures, I assembled the sort of idea of freeing all prisoners, untrapping all traps. And it's a very poetic idea. And some will argue with me that it's not pragmatic or possible. Yet I'm not the only one to have had this dream. A world without cages is a world I imagine to be beautiful. And if I have managed in any way to untrap someone or something, then I feel that I've accomplished something meaningful. We interact with the possibility of questing both consciously and unconsciously. When we repeat habits, we may be either expanding those possibilities or limiting them. Sometimes both. And this topic is deeply profound and very complex. I'm not going to cover it in minute detail today. My goal is merely to introduce the idea that our human birth gives us a variety of peculiar opportunities, perspectives, faculties, and so on, that are incredibly rare if we were to think of all of the possible incarnations we might take on as microbes or insects or animals or trees or living places and so on. As humans, we're uniquely endowed with the capacity, partly because we have hands, right? Maybe largely because we have hands, to have minds and do things that it seems very unlikely other organisms are endowed to do, though surely the reverse is also true. There might be forms of development available to a tree that are entirely unavailable to human beings, and surely the opposite is also so. But when we take on quests, and I'm not necessarily recommending that you do so, though I'm asking you to reflect on the possibility, when we consciously take on a quest, and I like those that are somewhat magical and seemingly in one way impossible. For example, one quest someone might take on is to learn to meaningfully communicate with a tree, which the vast majority of humans will consider to be both nonsensical and impossible. Neither of those things are true. I understand why people with no experience of this kind of thing are inclined to think this way. I'm not demanding that they think any other way. One of the things about me is that I acknowledge, and I think it's reasonable to do so, that each person is in the world in a very unique way. And while they might belong to classifications or groups, for example, they may, have some sort of gender expression, they may be a certain age, they might live in a certain place, they might be able-bodied or not, so on and so forth. Each of us is unique. Each of us has unique qualities. So too, we have unique opportunities to forge and accomplish quests that advance the development of aspects of our humanity, and perhaps even that very mysterious aspect I refer to as our soul. I like quests that start out seeming very unlikely. That's not the only kind I like, but it's one of my favorite kinds. And in case it isn't obvious, the whole quest and question dichotomy is very interesting, because a question is like a quest I am on, right? A quest I on. Or even the eye of questing is in me a light. It is turned on, right? I am seeing with the illumination that my purposes emit and receive back from having been emitted, right? So a quest can be kind of like a flashlight, right? You shine it into darkness and information comes back. I think this is perhaps the most important idea in this video, that a quest illumines and transforms relationships and identity, possibility, opportunity, necessity, all of the things that ordinarily we use to navigate in our experience and minds and imaginations and relationships and vocations and so on. And we can have quests in all the different aspects of our lives, and we can have quests that whose effect is mostly in some specific domain, or whose effect is very broad, it changes everything. But I'm a fan of the genre, as the phrase goes. And I think it can be very useful, playful, and profound to imagine whether or not it is quote unquote true. You see, there's many things that aren't intrinsically true or untrue. Their truth or non-truth depends on our relationship with them and how we are oriented, right? It's not true or untrue that there is love. What's true or untrue is that someone loves. Right? They're in the game in that way, right? And so truth can be a very deceptive idea, because the way we're in the world, the way we're in relationships, the way we're behaving, what we're looking for, how we are looking, why we are looking, all of these things affect whether something is true or not. Now, there are trivial truths, such as, I am in a garden. I am in what people call a garden, or people call that a tree, and that a shoe, and this my nose, and this my finger. Those are relatively trivially true. No one near me has touched me since I began this video. That's, well, as long as we're talking about people only, well, even then. No person physically next to me touched me while I made this video that I'm aware of at the moment. It's true. But when we ask questions about the nature of identity or being or belonging, now truth becomes very malleable and dependent on all kinds of things that we ordinarily don't consider. And particularly whether something is good or bad. This is a very, very sophisticated thing. Even though, again, there are we can identify simple aspects of the question. So I think our lives, we should preserve a big chunk of mystery for the nature of identity and being and origin and result. But we are almost a living question. And whether we engage this playfully, creatively, with consciousness and reverence, or whether we're just mostly pragmatic about it, our lives will encompass an array of developmental milestones, or not. Some of my quests remain secret. They're private to me. And others I'm happy to share and speak of more or less publicly. I think there's a profound... What is this? I think there's a profound relationship inside us between that which we might refer to as public and that which we might refer to as private. Many aspects of our humanity orbit these two fundamental, and of course there are gradients. It's not just, two things there. How private is it? Right? There are things I might share with close friends. There are things I might share with no one. There are things I might share with people I work with. There are things I might share with random people in public on Facebook and so on. There's this sort of these two concentric circles of degrees of public and private face, what we might call face, by which I mean persona. So part of my quest in general is to understand what it means to be human, or what it can mean, not just what it means. For it's not a given. It's not a given thing, what it means to be human, though we can stay mostly within the lines of what we're told it means in a lifetime, if we so choose. Many of us have heroes and heroines who don't do that. They quest. Some successfully, some lose their lives in the process. Some are tortured, imprisoned, die alone, and yet we revere the terrain revealed by the way their life illuminated the world. illuminated our humanity. And I think that's truly beautiful and perhaps somehow imperative. And in the modern mishmash of superculture and technology, images and noise and commercial products of what was once creative activity, perhaps it's never been more imperative that we take on and embody and quests that illuminate our humanity for each other, with each other, together, for the sake of all beings, for the sake of the living world, for the sake of the essence of our humanity. I suspect I will touch upon this topic again, and I have probably touched on it in previous videos. But if you so choose, I hope you will join me in a great and as yet unstructured adventure. The adventure of discovering and returning to common knowledge and experience the nature of the essence of our being, our humanity, our consciousness, our intelligence, our creativity. For all the quests that are born of these urges fascinate me, and I find them beautiful. And in so much as we walk together with this purpose, I trust we will become a light that shines not only here and now, but in all of human history, and with luck, deep into the future. Thank you for joining me. And I welcome your questions, comments, ideas, and sharing. Bye-bye for now.